Hello and welcome back to Unwinding Minds, where we talk about all things mental health, chronic illness and disability. If we haven't met before, hi, I'm Rosie. I'm a counsellor in the UK who specialises in working with those with chronic illness and disabilities. I also make these videos on the side to help and support the understanding of various mental health conditions and struggles that those with chronic illnesses face. Today, I want to have a conversation together about something that very often gets twisted, flattened, or even sometimes glamorized on the silver screen: mental health. Specifically, we're going to be talking about post-traumatic stress disorder today and how film and television have, for decades, reduced it to a handful of cliches. This video is going to be part of a wider series talking about depictions of mental health on screen and the effect that those have on us. So do consider subscribing if that sounds interesting to you, because there will be more videos like this in the future. One thing I do want to say before we start off this video is if you believe that it could be triggering for you, please watch another video, turn it off. There's no need to put yourself through it if it feels like it's not going to be productive or helpful to you. Viewer discretion is advised. And also, none of the videos on this channel are mental health advice, okay? It's not the same as a counselling session. It's very, very different. Your circumstances may be very different than the ones that we talk about in these videos. With all of that said, let's dive in together, shall we? Before we jump in, I want you to try and bring to mind the last time that you saw PTSD on screen, or a portrayal that stuck with you. Most of us have watched plenty of films or TV shows where PTSD features, even if it isn't named as such throughout the runtime. If you close your eyes and picture a character with PTSD, what comes to mind? Perhaps it's a soldier or some kind of warrior, probably American, probably male, possibly white, jolting awake after a nightmare about the war. Maybe he's been drinking too much. Maybe he can't connect with his family. Maybe what he's haunted by is what he's seen. You know the scenes that I'm talking about because they tend to fall into one specific stereotype a lot. That soldier waking up from the nightmare, drenched in sweat, the flashbacks or angry outbursts. And the thing is, it's almost always depicted in this context as dramatic, showy, and often a temporary hurdle that acts more as a plot device rather than part of the everyday life of their character and their experiences. That stereotypical depiction is really incomplete because PTSD is not only bad dreams. It's not only traumatic memories of explosions in the mind or of sudden bursts of rage. There's a lot more to it, and in many ways it's far lonelier and more isolating than it's usually depicted as. It can be terrifying and leave the people struggling with it questioning whether their experiences are normal or not. This image of PTSD is everywhere, from American Sniper to The Hurt Locker or Rambo to the MCU. Now, these films often mean well, and some of them do a pretty good job of depicting certain aspects of PTSD. They're often trying to show us the real cost of violence and the toll of war on a person's mind. But what they tend to do, sometimes without realizing, is flatten PTSD into something that looks good on screen. They also tend to keep the link tied in people's minds between PTSD and war, rather than something that can happen in a variety of life circumstances. PTSD in movies becomes an event, rather than a state of being. In most of these stories, PTSD is represented by those sudden intrusive moments like flashbacks or nightmares or trembling hands, but that doesn't depict the layers of feeling that exist in PTSD. It's numbness, it's disconnection, it's feeling unsafe in your body, or disassociating, forgetting how to trust the world, feeling misunderstood and completely alone. And those things make for a very different kind of cinema, not action-oriented as often the characters struggling with PTSD are in modern movies. They make for quiet, slow, and deeply internal experiences, which admittedly are much harder to film, though not impossible. It takes a lot of runtime to show the many layers of recovery and experiences. So directors go for what's visible and quick, the sweat or screaming or shaking hands, etc. But that in turn teaches the audience that this is what PTSD is. Before we go any further, it's worth looking back for a moment, back to the early 20th century, when what we now call PTSD was first recognised, though under a very different name: shell shock. Sometimes to understand how we got somewhere, we have to go back to the beginning. During the First World War, thousands of soldiers returned from the trenches unable to speak, trembling uncontrollably, haunted by nightmares and flashbacks. The mental health field was in its infancy, basically non-existent at this point in history. At the time, doctors believed that the psychological symptoms were caused by the physical impact, the concussive force of explosions, the shells or bombs literally shocking the nervous system. But it became clear as the war dragged on that even soldiers who weren't on the front line, who'd never been near explosions, suffered the exact same symptoms. And that's when the penny dropped, that it wasn't about damaged nerves. It was about psychological trauma, the mind's way of responding to horror that it couldn't process. Of course, we can unfortunately look back and see now that the world really just wasn't ready for that idea. The men who struggled with symptoms of PTSD were sadly not treated with kindness on a wider scale in their community. They were branded as cowards or weaklings, and many were even court-martialed. Some were even shot and killed for lack of courage, which is deeply depressing. It took decades and, heartbreakingly, more wars before shell shock evolved into what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder. That history really matters because it shows how long society has struggled to understand trauma. We have mostly moved away from calling it cowardice to then calling it madness to finally, hopefully, recognizing it as a deeply human response to inhuman experiences. But traces of that old misunderstanding really do linger, and there are people who believe sincerely still that it's a moral failing to struggle with mental health conditions. When films reduce PTSD to dramatic breakdowns, it echoes that same old idea that trauma must be visible, explosive, and obvious to be real. It also continues to share its association with war, and there are people who would not believe that PTSD can even be related to anything other than war. I'd like to take a look together at a couple of films and analyse the ways that the characters respond to trauma. The first one really does try to show trauma, and it goes part of the way to succeeding. I'm talking about Iron Man 3. And specifically the panic attack scene. It starts off as a quiet moment. Tony Stark is chatting with a young boy when he's suddenly asked a question: how did you get out of the wormhole? It's a simple question, but it triggers something deep and primal in Tony, and his reaction is immediate and portrayed very well. His breathing quickens, his hands shake, his voice falters, he runs away outside, gasping for air. The world feels too small and dangerous all of a sudden, and he gets into his suit and asks the AI to check what's wrong with him because he assumes that something's attacked him. That's how real the sensations are. Now, it's a remarkably accurate depiction of a panic attack, especially one rooted in trauma. The sudden trigger leading to physical overwhelm and hyperarousal, the disorientation, the feeling that you're dying, these are things that people with PTSD often experience, and the film deserves credit for that. It doesn't glamorize the moment or dress it up. It shows it as frightening and as isolating. Throughout the Iron Man movies, we continue to see fragments of Tony's PTSD, his obsessive working, his persistent fear that he and the people he loves are in danger. We even get a couple of nightmare scenes as well. Something I love about the film's approach to PTSD is in the quiet moments that Tony shares with Pepper. They portray a pretty supportive relationship where she endeavours to understand and help Tony. We can see that this support doesn't always or necessarily change Tony's actions, but we do get an example of a character trying to do their best to be with the person who's affected, which is important. The biggest problem that I can identify with the films, though, is what tends to happen after these high-impact scenes depicting the effects of the trauma. Particularly the panic attack scene, curiously. Tony simply hops back into his car. He makes a quick joke, a quip, and he carries on. There's no lingering aftermath, no emotional exhaustion, no sense that this moment will stay with him. It's neatly packaged, a short burst of drama that's quickly tidied away so that the plot, the important stuff, can continue. This is where Hollywood often stumbles. Trauma becomes a character beat, not a lived reality. It's treated like a temporary glitch or character hurdle rather than an ongoing condition that shapes relationships, decision-making, even one's sense of safety in the world. They do a pretty good job in the Iron Man films, though, to be fair. They deserve some praise for even including these moments. In the landscape of blockbuster cinema, where the main character is usually unflinching, super cool, often unaffected at all by their experiences, acknowledging that a superhero would likely have PTSD is itself progress. It opens the door to more nuanced and compassionate storytelling. If only the film had lingered a little longer on that discomfort. And then we have an example within the same cinematic universe where the approach taken to PTSD is very, very tone deaf. I am talking about Thor. By the time of Infinity War and Endgame, Thor has lost his homeland, his brother, multiple times I might add, his parents, his best friend, and his girlfriend has broken up with him too. As if all of that weren't enough, he carries a huge emotional weight around with him of feeling that he personally failed to protect the universe. Thor has been through as much, if not more, than all of the other characters, and as a result of this compounding trauma, he withdraws and begins to use coping mechanisms that are destructive in their nature. He overeats, he ceases to look after his personal appearance and health, and there are many other signs peppered throughout that his mental health has seriously tanked. He uses alcohol and humour to numb himself, and he's emotionally withdrawn, staying away from his friends. There is so much about this depiction that could have been incredibly valuable to explore in terms of PTSD and the associated depression, the avoidance, the shame, loss of purpose, and the deep guilt of a survivor who feels he's failed. What the film gestures toward but doesn't fully explore is how Thor's identity, once built on heroism and physical strength, collapses under the weight of that guilt. It was so frustrating to me to have them be this close to getting a more nuanced picture of PTSD on screen, but the film really is let down by the other characters. Thor's weight gain is played for laughs. His struggles are consistently minimised by other characters and treated as a loss of perspective rather than a natural reaction. I am sure that it frustrated many people to see similar pains to the ones that they had felt be turned into an opportunity to laugh at the person's suffering. Now again, this is partly perhaps down to the fact that the film is already packed with so much story that they only get to scratch the surface to make sure that the runtime isn't too long. But I don't think that this is entirely the case, unfortunately. I'll come back to a point I made earlier about Iron Man. Tony has pepper. Thor does not get the emotional relief of support from another character until he encounters his mother. None of his friends or teammates are supportive. They're actually very antagonistic. What does that tell us about how we, the audience, are supposed to feel about what has happened to Thor and his reaction to it? We are supposed to be laughing along at the fat jokes. Here we see a man struggling, and as is unfortunately increasingly common, we're supposed to laugh at him. There is an underlying expectation that as a hero and as a man, he should never have gotten to the emotional or physical place he is in. Cinema flinches away from vulnerability when it becomes too real, raw, and messy. If a character, particularly a male character, if I may say so without becoming, overly political, experiences several traumatic events but does not pull themselves together alone and tough it out without more than the occasional outburst, he is somehow failing himself. It bothers me because this character is experiencing shame, and we are expected to agree on a certain level that he should be ashamed of gaining weight and withdrawing. It's just not kind. The reality is this: PTSD is extremely hard to navigate without support. It's hard to navigate with support. So why the hell am I, a counsellor, even talking about this? Why am I fussing over these portrayals of PTSD? It's because of the potential social harm. It's because the stories that we see change what we view as being part of PTSD. Films portraying mental health struggles can cause social harm in a number of ways. The first, when we see PTSD predominantly affecting veterans or warriors, it flattens PTSD into something which is just a product of war, rather than traumatizing experiences such as sexual violence, car accidents, or even the sudden violent death of a loved one. The second, we see depictions of acceptable levels of struggle and acceptable or unacceptable responses, which are highly gendered. The third, that PTSD is treated as something that is only felt in specific situations like nightmares or flashbacks, rather than in the everyday. According to statistics on PTSD UK, it's estimated that 1 in 10 people in the UK are expected to experience PTSD at some point in their lives. To give that some perspective, that's more than 6.5 million people. That number is always on the increase too, and the range of traumatic life events that can cause PTSD or CPTSD are extremely wide. That matters when we consider how we converse about mental health, or when we make creative projects that depict certain mental health conditions or struggles. Another thing, the prevalence of PTSD is much higher in women than it is in men. It would be really lovely to see that reflected more in film. At the time of recording this, the lifetime prevalence is 10 to 12% in women and 5 to 6% in men. So why are we stuck on this idea of a male character waking up with nightmares and flashbacks so much still? Ugh, drives me nuts. There is additionally an expectation that men with PTSD are more likely to be violent or angry, which is really harmful for obvious reasons. I didn't talk about this earlier, but the tie to violence as a product of war also flattens out many other causes of PTSD. What we see on the screen affects our perception of each other in real life in very real ways, especially if we don't make an active effort to understand one another. The people who are quietly suffering with PTSD are often not believed, and because they don't look traumatized in the ways that we've been taught by the media to look out for, survivors who dissociate or have memory difficulty, who avoid others or shut down, are not even noticed. It affects the type of support that those people with PTSD receive. And worse still, people with PTSD can internalize those portrayals as well. They might think, well, I don't have flashbacks, so maybe I'm fine. Or I'm not screaming at night, so maybe it wasn't that bad. Maybe I'm making a fuss. All that happens to me is not being able to remember stuff, confusion with tasks that I used to find easy, feeling like I can't talk to other people, so I must be fine. It must not be PTSD. As a counsellor, that side of it is heartbreaking because it invalidates real suffering and it keeps people from reaching out for help or getting the right support. I know this because I've spoken to clients many, many times who have struggled with the idea that PTSD might be playing a role in how they feel. I have had many conversations with people wondering if what they are experiencing after a traumatic event is normal because it doesn't look like what they're used to seeing. It can damage self-esteem, it can isolate people, and unfortunately even lead them to hurting themselves. There is a lot of stigma towards victims of violence. People with PTSD are often treated like they're ticking time bombs, as potentially violent towards others. And the statistics just don't reflect that. People with PTSD are much more likely to harm themselves than to harm others. To be fair to filmmakers, PTSD, like many mental health struggles, is difficult to portray. It's largely internal, cyclical, it's hard to see. You can't always show it with action. It's usually more effective to show the small moments. It's in the way someone flinches when the door slams, or the way they stare at a photograph for a few seconds too long, or how they change the subject when something hits a bit too close to home. It's in checking where the exits are when you're in a crowded place. These are small moments, subtle things, that could be more effectively sprinkled into films to improve the way that media interacts with mental health. That's why we need more writers, directors, and actors who listen and collaborate with mental health professionals, or who speak to real survivors, who understand that trauma, it doesn't have to be loud to be real. There are some films that get closer to the less sensational view of PTSD, films like The Deer Hunter or The Fisher King, or more recently, films like Room or Mayor of Easttown, that show healing as messy and non-linear. They let their characters be broken down by their experiences and rebuilding themselves at the same time. And that's what real healing looks like, don't you think? It's not in a straight line. It fluctuates. It's a dance between coping well and collapsing and getting back up again. So I guess the core of what I want to get across to those watching this is this. PTSD is not a cinematic flourish or a handy plot twist, and there is responsibility in trying to portray any mental health condition on screen. It's a real mental health condition that influences many people on multiple levels every single day. And if you feel unseen in your struggles, if it's you who is going through this hardship, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that you aren't being seen. You deserve help and support. I think it's assumed far too often that help is easy to come by. I know that it isn't. I know how disabling PTSD can be, how it can make life grind to a halt and destroy relationships. I know that help can feel very hard to access, and that gaining the understanding of loved ones is not always so simple. If you are struggling right now, please, I implore you, keep reaching out for help. If you've made it to the end, I am very grateful to you for spending this time with me today. Don't forget to like the video if you have enjoyed it or if you've learned something, or to subscribe and turn on notifications if you would like to see more videos like this. And if you have ideas about what you would like to see, put them down in the comments section below. We explore a lot of different areas of mental health, illness, neurodivergence and disability on this channel, and we do upload quite regularly. And check the description if you're interested in working with me on the issues that we discussed in this video, as I do offer private counselling services. Thank you so much for watching, and take really good care.